The armory sergeant looked at her request form and burst into laughter. Advanced tactical weapons? Lady, you're just inventory staff. You organize paper clips and count bullets. But when Staff Sergeant Rivera reached across the counter to sign the paperwork, her sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal something that made the 4-star general standing behind him go completely silent. Because the black ink symbol on her wrist wasn't just a tattoo, it was a mark that only 12 people in the entire United States military had ever earned, and according to classified records, most of them were supposed to be dead. What happened next would shatter everything Fort Hendricks thought they knew about the quiet woman who had been managing their weapons for 3 years. Because Rivera wasn't just any supply sergeant, she was Raven 7, a ghost operative from the most classified special operations program in military history. And the equipment request that had brought a Pentagon general to their remote base wasn't for training exercises. It was for a real threat that was already moving against them, and the only person qualified to stop it had been hiding in plain sight, quietly organizing their ammunition while keeping secrets that could change the course of national security. Before we continue this incredible story, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Staff Sergeant Maria Rivera moved through the inventory process with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated every day for the past 3 years. Her uniform was regulation perfect, pressed and clean, with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun that revealed nothing unusual about her appearance. At 42, she had the quiet demeanor of someone who preferred efficiency over conversation, completing paperwork with neat handwriting and managing supply chains without fanfare. The other personnel at Fort Hendricks knew her as reliable but unremarkable. She processed weapon requests, maintained inventory logs, and coordinated ammunition deliveries with the same steady competence that made her nearly invisible in the daily operations of the base. Soldiers would approach her counter, submit their forms, receive their approved equipment, and rarely think about the woman who made it all possible. Rivera had cultivated this anonymity carefully. She arrived early, stayed late when necessary, and never drew attention to herself through complaints or suggestions. Her service record at Fort Hendricks showed 3 years of exemplary performance in logistics and armory management, with commendations for accuracy and reliability. What it didn't show was anything about her previous assignments, which were redacted in files that most personnel didn't have clearance to access. That morning started like any other. Rivera unlocked the armory at precisely 0600, conducted her standard security sweep, and began preparing for the day's scheduled weapon distributions. The requests were routine: standard-issue rifles for training exercises, sidearms for guard duty rotations, and maintenance equipment for the base's vehicle fleet. Nothing that required her to deviate from the established protocols she followed with clockwork precision. At 0630, Corporal Jenkins arrived for his shift as armory assistant. Fresh out of logistics school and eager to prove himself, Jenkins had been assigned to Rivera's section 6 months earlier. He approached his duties with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on presumption, frequently offering suggestions about how operations could be improved or streamlined. "Morning, Sergeant Rivera," Jenkins said as he clocked in and began reviewing the day's request log. "Looks like a heavy training day. 3rd Battalion has requested a full loadout for field exercises." Rivera nodded without looking up from her paperwork. "Standard issue only. All requests have been verified through command channels." Jenkins glanced at the list again, then frowned. "Actually, there's an unusual request here. Someone from command has submitted a requisition for specialized tactical equipment, says it's for training evaluation purposes." Rivera's pen paused for a fraction of a second before she continued writing. "Submitted through the proper authorization channels. Specialized equipment requires command approval." "It already has command approval," Jenkins replied, holding up a form with official signatures. but it's signed by someone I don't recognize. The name is redacted, but the clearance level is higher than anything I've seen before." Before Rivera could respond, the armory's main door opened with a metallic clang. Master Sergeant Phillips entered, followed by two officers whose rank insignia immediately commanded attention. One was Colonel Bradley, the base commander, whose presence in the armory was unusual enough to make Jenkins straighten his posture reflexively. The other was a general whose uniform bore decorations that suggested extensive combat experience and high-level security clearances. "Good morning, Sergeant Rivera," Colonel Bradley said as the group approached the main counter. "We need to discuss some specialized equipment requirements for an upcoming operation." Rivera set down her pen and stood at attention. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" The general stepped forward, his eyes scanning the armory's organization with the appraising gaze of someone familiar with military logistics. "We have a situation that requires immediate access to advanced tactical equipment. The request has been submitted through proper channels, but time is critical." Rivera moved to her computer terminal and pulled up the requisition system. "I'll need to verify the authorization codes and ensure all documentation is complete before releasing any specialized equipment, sir." Master Sergeant Phillips shifted uncomfortably. "Sergeant Rivera, this is General Morrison from Joint Special Operations Command. The authorization comes directly from the Pentagon." Rivera's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the digital request forms on her screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, checking inventory numbers and security protocols. "The system shows the request has been submitted, but it requires additional verification for the specific items requested." General Morrison studied Rivera with increased interest. Something about her demeanor, her precise movements, and her careful attention to protocol triggered a recognition that he couldn't immediately place. "What items are being requested, Sergeant?" Rivera read from the screen. "Advanced night vision systems, specialized communication equipment, tactical breach tools, and precision rifle components that are classified above standard infantry access levels." Corporal Jenkins looked puzzled. Who would need that kind of equipment for a training exercise? The question hung in the air for a moment before Colonel Bradley cleared his throat. "The exercise involves testing new security protocols against simulated special operations infiltration attempts. We need to ensure our defensive measures are adequate against highly trained adversaries." Rivera continued reviewing the request with methodical attention to detail. "The inventory system shows these items are available, but release requires biometric authorization from someone with appropriate clearance levels." General Morrison stepped closer to the counter. "I have the required clearance. Proceed with the release authorization." Rivera began entering the authorization sequence into her terminal. As she worked, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a portion of her left wrist. For most observers, it would have been an unremarkable glimpse of skin. But General Morrison's trained eye caught something that made him freeze mid-sentence. There, partially visible beneath the fabric of her uniform sleeve, was the edge of a tattoo. Not the decorative artwork that many soldiers displayed, but something far more significant. The visible portion showed intricate black linework that formed part of a symbol Morrison recognized from the deepest levels of military special operations. Rivera noticed the general's intense stare and quickly pulled her sleeve down, but it was too late. Morrison had seen enough to trigger memories of classified briefings and operational reports from years past. His expression shifted from routine authority to something approaching shock. "Sergeant Rivera," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. "May I see your service record?" Rivera's jaw tightened slightly. "Sir, my current assignment documentation is available through standard channels." "I'm not asking about your current assignment," Morrison replied. "I'm asking about your complete service history." Colonel Bradley looked confused by the exchange. "General, Is there something about Sergeant Rivera's record that concerns you? Morrison continued studying Rivera's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Sergeant, would you mind showing me your left wrist? The armory fell silent, except for the distant sounds of base operations filtering through the reinforced walls. Rivera stood motionless for several seconds, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's steady gaze. Finally, she reached for her left sleeve and slowly pushed the fabric up her forearm. The tattoo was fully revealed in stark black ink against her skin. It depicted a stylized eagle with outstretched wings, clutching a lightning bolt in its talons. Beneath the eagle, barely visible unless examined closely, were small numerical designations that meant nothing to most observers, but everything to those familiar with the most classified levels of military special operations. General Morrison's breath caught in his throat. Unit designation: Raven 7. Rivera remained silent, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The quiet efficiency that had characterized her movements was replaced by something more alert, more prepared. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, then caught himself and straightened. "Colonel Bradley, I need to speak with you privately, immediately." Colonel Bradley looked between Morrison and Rivera with growing confusion. "General, what exactly is going on here?" Morrison turned to face the colonel directly. "Colonel, you have been hosting one of the most highly decorated special operations veterans in the entire United States military. And apparently, nobody knew it." Corporal Jenkins dropped the clipboard he had been holding. "What are you talking about, sir?" Morrison gestured toward Rivera's exposed tattoo. "That symbol represents completion of the Raven program, the most classified special operations training ever conducted by the U.S. military. Only 12 people have ever earned that mark, and according to official records, most of them are dead." Rivera finally spoke, her voice steady but carrying undertones that hadn't been present in her previous 3 years of routine interactions. "General Morrison, with respect, those records are classified for operational security reasons." "Operational security," Morrison repeated slowly. "Sergeant Rivera, what was your operational designation in the Raven program?" Rivera hesitated for a long moment before responding. "Raven 7, sir. Ghost Protocols and Advanced Infiltration Specialist." The armory fell into complete silence. Even the background sounds of the base seemed muted by the weight of the revelation occurring within the reinforced walls of the weapons storage facility. Colonel Bradley found his voice first. "General, I've been commanding this base for 2 years. Sergeant Rivera's file shows 3 years of exemplary service in logistics and armory management. There's no mention of any special operations background." Morrison nodded grimly. "There wouldn't be. Raven program participants were given new identities and clean service records after the program was officially terminated. The nature of their training and operational history was considered too sensitive for standard military documentation." Jenkins looked at Rivera with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet, efficient supply sergeant he had worked with for 6 months with the elite operative being described by the general. "But she's been working inventory and processing routine weapon requests." "Cover assignment," Morrison explained. "Deep cover integration into standard military operations while maintaining security clearances and skills through unofficial channels." Rivera stepped forward slightly. "General, if I may, the Raven program was terminated for good reasons. Participants were offered the opportunity to integrate into conventional military roles with full pension and benefit protections. I chose to accept that offer." Morrison studied her carefully. "And yet, here you are, processing a request for exactly the type of specialized equipment that would be needed for a Raven-level operation." The implication hung heavy in the air. Rivera looked at the computer screen displaying the equipment request, then back at Morrison. "Sir, are you suggesting this isn't actually for a training exercise?" Morrison exchanged a meaningful glance with Colonel Bradley before responding. Sergeant Rivera, we have a situation. 3 days ago, intelligence assets detected what appears to be an imminent threat against this installation. The nature of the threat suggests adversaries with special operations training comparable to our own elite units. Rivera's demeanor shifted again, the careful anonymity of her cover role giving way to the alert readiness of someone trained for high-stakes operations. What type of threat assessment, sir? Infiltration and sabotage, Morrison replied. The intelligence suggests the adversaries have detailed knowledge of our security protocols and defensive measures. Conventional security responses may not be adequate. Colonel Bradley looked troubled. General, why wasn't I briefed on this threat assessment? Because we needed to verify the credibility of the intelligence before raising alarm levels across the base, Morrison explained. But the equipment request that brought me here suggests someone with knowledge of the situation is already taking precautionary measures. Rivera glanced at her computer terminal. The request was submitted using authorization codes that I've never seen before. Someone with access to classified operational protocols. Morrison nodded. Someone who knew that we would need a Raven-level response and that we had a Raven operative in place to coordinate it. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place. Rivera's assignment to Fort Hendricks, her position managing the armory, her access to specialized equipment, and her deep cover identity all suggested careful planning by someone with knowledge of both the Raven program and the current threat situation. Sir, Rivera said carefully, if this is an active operation, I need to know the scope and timeline. 3 years of cover assignment doesn't erase training and instincts. Morrison looked at Colonel Bradley. Colonel, I'm upgrading the security classification of this conversation. What I'm about to discuss is compartmentalized information. Bradley nodded his understanding. Corporal Jenkins, you're dismissed. This conversation is classified above your clearance level. Jenkins looked confused but followed orders, exiting the armory with obvious reluctance. Once the door closed behind him, Morrison continued. Sergeant Rivera, intelligence suggests the threat will materialize within the next 48 hours. The adversaries appear to have inside knowledge of our defensive protocols, which means conventional security measures may be compromised. Rivera absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone trained to process operational briefings under pressure. What's the recommended response protocol, sir? That's where things get complicated, Morrison admitted. The Raven program was terminated partially because the operations became too aggressive for standard military oversight. Reactivating Raven protocols, even temporarily, requires authorization levels that may not be available within the time frame we're facing. Rivera understood the implications. You need a Raven-level response without official Raven authorization. Exactly, Morrison confirmed, which brings us to an interesting question. Are you willing to operate under unofficial capacity to protect this installation and its personnel? The question carried enormous weight. Rivera would be risking her carefully constructed cover identity, her secure position within conventional military structure, and potentially her career and freedom, all to address a threat that might or might not materialize according to intelligence that might or might not be accurate. Rivera looked around the armory that had been her workplace for 3 years. The routine efficiency of inventory management and supply chain logistics had provided a sense of stability and normalcy that her previous life had never offered. But the skills and instincts that had earned her the Raven 7 designation were not the kind that could be permanently suppressed. General Morrison, she said finally, if the threat is real and conventional responses are inadequate, then the protection of this base and its personnel takes priority over my cover status. Morrison nodded with obvious relief. I was hoping you'd say that. Now, about that equipment request. Rivera turned back to her computer terminal and began entering authorization codes that she hadn't used in 3 years. The specialized equipment will be ready for deployment within 1 hour. But if we're moving to Raven protocols, we'll need additional resources. What kind of additional resources? Rivera's fingers moved across the keyboard with new purpose. Communications equipment that can't be intercepted, surveillance gear for perimeter monitoring, and defensive tools that can neutralize special operations-level infiltration attempts. As she worked, her entire demeanor transformed from the quiet efficiency of a supply sergeant to the focused intensity of an elite operative preparing for a high-stakes mission. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with special operations personnel. Morrison watched the transformation with professional appreciation. "Sergeant Rivera, how long since you've operated at full Raven capacity?" 3 years, sir, but the training and protocols are designed for permanent integration. Time doesn't degrade the fundamental skills. Colonel Bradley, who had been listening to the exchange with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "General, I need to understand what's happening here. Are you telling me that one of my logistics personnel is actually an elite special operations veteran who's been operating under deep cover for 3 years? Morrison nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Colonel. And right now, she may be the only thing standing between this base and a successful enemy infiltration." Rivera completed her equipment preparations and turned back to the group. "Gentlemen, if we're moving forward with this operation, we need to establish clear command protocols. General Morrison, are you taking operational command, or am I operating with autonomous authority?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "Given the time constraints and the specialized nature of the threat, you'll have autonomous operational authority with my oversight and support. Colonel Bradley will coordinate conventional security measures while you handle special operations level responses." Rivera nodded her understanding. "Then we need to begin immediately. The equipment is ready for deployment, but I'll need access to base communication systems and perimeter monitoring capabilities." As the 3 officers prepared to leave the armory, Rivera paused at her computer terminal one final time. She entered a series of commands that would permanently alter her status within the military database, officially ending her cover assignment and reactivating her special operations classification. "General," she said as she completed the process, "there's one more thing you should know. The Raven program wasn't terminated just because of operational aggressiveness. It was terminated because participants became too effective at operating independently of standard military oversight." Morrison met her gaze steadily. "Meaning?" "Meaning that once Raven protocols are reactivated, the operation becomes my responsibility. You can provide support and coordination, but tactical decisions will be mine to make." Morrison nodded his understanding. "Accepted. Just remember that the objective is to protect this base and its personnel, not to eliminate every potential threat in a 50-mile radius." Rivera allowed herself a slight smile, the first genuine expression she had shown in the 3 years since arriving at Fort Hendricks. "Understood, sir. But if the threat materializes, I'll handle it according to Raven protocols." As they left the armory together, Colonel Bradley couldn't help but look back at the facility where his quiet, efficient logistics sergeant had just revealed herself to be one of the military's most elite operatives. The base he had commanded for 2 years suddenly felt like unfamiliar territory, full of hidden capabilities and classified operations that existed beneath the surface of routine military activities. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher above Fort Hendricks, and the base continued its daily operations without any awareness that everything had changed. Soldiers conducted training exercises, mechanics serviced vehicles, and administrative personnel processed paperwork, all unaware that their protection now rested in the hands of someone they had never really known. Rivera walked between Morrison and Bradley with the confident stride of someone who had reclaimed her true identity after years of careful concealment. The tattoo on her wrist, no longer hidden beneath fabric, caught the sunlight and reflected the specialized training that had shaped her into one of the military's most dangerous assets. The next 48 hours would determine whether the intelligence was accurate and whether 3 years of cover assignment had diminished her operational capabilities. But as Rivera began planning her response to the potential threat, her movements carried the precision and purpose of someone for whom special operations were not just training, but fundamental identity. Fort Hendricks was about to discover that appearances could be extraordinarily deceiving, and that the most dangerous person on the base had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, managing their weapons and equipment with the same lethal efficiency she had once applied to much more dangerous missions. The Raven was operational once again. As they left the armory together, Colonel Bradley couldn't help but look back at the facility where his quiet, efficient logistics sergeant had just revealed herself to be one of the military's most elite operatives. The base he had commanded for 2 years suddenly felt like unfamiliar territory, full of hidden capabilities and classified operations that existed beneath the surface of routine military activities. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher above Fort Hendricks, and the base continued its daily operations without any awareness that everything had changed. Soldiers conducted training exercises, mechanics serviced vehicles, and administrative personnel processed paperwork, all unaware that their protection now rested in the hands of someone they had never really known. 18 hours later, as darkness fell across Fort Hendricks, Rivera's prediction proved devastatingly accurate. The infiltration came exactly as intelligence had suggested. 6 highly trained operatives with intimate knowledge of the base's security protocols, moving through blind spots that shouldn't have existed. But they hadn't counted on Raven 7. Rivera intercepted the first 2 infiltrators at the eastern perimeter, using techniques that left no trace, no evidence, no witnesses. The remaining 4 never made it past the communications building, where she had positioned herself with equipment that officially didn't exist, and skills that had never been documented. By 0400 hours, the threat was neutralized. The base slept peacefully, unaware that a war had been fought and won in the shadows around them. General Morrison found Rivera in the armory at dawn, calmly restocking the specialized equipment that had saved Fort Hendricks. Her uniform was regulation perfect once again, her hair neatly arranged, no sign of the night's events except for a small cut on her left hand. "It's done?" Morrison asked quietly. Rivera nodded without looking up from her inventory checklist. Threat eliminated. No collateral damage. No evidence trail. Morrison studied her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. And now? Rivera finally met his gaze, and for a moment the general saw something in her eyes that reminded him why the Raven program had been both the military's greatest success and its most dangerous creation. "Now, General, I go back to counting bullets and organizing paper clips," she said with the faintest trace of a smile, "unless you have a better idea." Morrison glanced at the computer terminal where Rivera's service record now showed her true classification. "I think I might. How do you feel about a promotion and a transfer to Special Operations Command?" Rivera considered the offer for a long moment, then slowly rolled down her sleeve, covering the Raven 7 tattoo once again. "I think, sir, that some birds are meant to stay in the shadows." 3 months later, Fort Hendricks received a new logistics coordinator. Rivera's transfer orders were classified, her destination redacted, her future assignments marked with clearance levels that didn't appear on standard military documentation. The only trace of her time at the base was a small notation in the armory's maintenance log, written in her precise handwriting. "All systems operational, inventory secure, mission complete. Corporal Jenkins, now promoted to sergeant and running the armory, would sometimes wonder about the quiet woman who had trained him. He never learned the full truth about what happened that night, but he noticed that after Rivera left, no security drills at Fort Hendricks ever found a single vulnerability in their defensive protocols. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world are the ones you never suspect. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that never make the news. And sometimes the person organizing your supplies and counting your equipment is the same person who could save your life without you ever knowing they were there. The Raven had flown back into the shadows, but her legacy remained, a base that was safer, a threat that would never return, and the quiet knowledge that true heroes don't need recognition. They just need the mission to be complete. Because in the end, that's what Raven 7 had always been about, protecting people who would never know they needed protection, fighting wars that would never be acknowledged, and ensuring that freedom's price was paid by those willing to remain forever unnamed. The armory at Fort Hendricks hummed quietly under fluorescent lights, weapons secured, inventory complete, and secrets safely buried beneath routine and regulation. Exactly the way Rivera had left it, exactly the way she intended it to stay.